Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to begin the Tokyo Conference 2021 organized by the Genron NPO. I am Nishimura, in charge of the international affairs from the Genron NPO. I have an honor to serve as a moderator. For this conference, we have participants from 14 countries, including Japan, the panelists, and also all the viewers who are joining us from online. So this Tokyo conference started in 2014, but for the first time we are organizing this event online because of the pandemic. Although this is an online meeting, we are able to have around 40 representatives from different fields across the world, and I truly appreciate your participation. Now I'd like to hand over to the president of Genron NPO, Mr. Kudo.
Thank you very much, and long time no see, everybody. Good. I would like to have this conversation over a drink, but due to the current situations, please allow us to conduct this event online. This is the fourth of this Tokyo conference, and we launched this conference because the world's free economy, multilateral international cooperation, and democracy were facing difficulties, and cracks were beginning to appear in the world. We, the think tanks of the world, decided to work together to confront the global crisis. And so 4 years ago, with the participation of representatives of the world leading think tanks, 10 of them, we, Genron NPO, launched this conference here in Tokyo. I have a strong feeling that Japan should be more active in contributing to global issues. And every year we have been holding discussions and raised issues with the world. I thought it was tremendous challenges that we were taking up. And this year, we chose as our overall theme the very issue that we have been aware of since the beginning of the Tokyo conference, that is to say, how can we restore international cooperation and democracy? And liberal economy is also another issue we cover in the same context. And on a rule, being rule-based, and we will consider an harmonious development of the world. However, the crisis has become even more grave in the last 4 years, unfortunately. Therefore, the restoration of an international cooperation and democracy, which is the challenge being faced with the administration, we need to also address this. But then what the administration is saying is slightly different in some aspects as to what we are saying. We are not in this Tokyo conference on any stations and nations. Freedom, liberalism, and democracy, and the international cooperation, we really would like to restore them. And for that purpose, many people are gathering here in the framework of the Tokyo conference. This is our view. The difference between countries is that we are the sovereigns. If the sovereigns ourselves, if we do not think ourselves about the restoration of democracy and freedom and the international cooperation, and if we leave all of that to the governments, then we all the same as authoritarian states. So I think there is the meaning for us to have our discussion. So the cooperation amongst the democracies, democratic countries, if it doesn't, it is not supposed to be simply as a steer against a specific nation. We would like to contribute to the democracy in the world as a whole. In this Tokyo Conference 2021, this year, from 10 countries that we are gathering with our friends from think tanks, but not only them. We have almost 40 participants because many other people wanted to participate as well. That means probably that the world is really facing a tremendous challenge. Some actions that really felt compelling by many people, increasing number of people. This is my feeling. So over these 2 days, we are going to have discussions with this strong willingness to contribute about 5 different themes. As I said, first of all, democracy and international cooperation are restoring to the economy needs to be also restored, and we have to think of, on the other hand, an pandemic with 120 million persons infected by the virus of the COVID-19. I would say that the world as a whole failed to handle it rightly. This is my point. Problem raising, which is quite provocating, but we should really not repeat this. So in a true sense, international cooperation is really questioned about and needed. And also there is an issue of an Indo-Pacific, of which China is very much wary. So what would be the meaning of gathering democratic countries in this context needs to be properly discussed as well. And I am truly delighted that many people are participating in this discussion over these important themes. This is an online event this time, which is quite a pity. I really wanted to show you a beautiful image of Japan, but it was not easy to choose a right one. And I would love to have a conversation, full conversation over good drinks with all of you, but we really would like to have a very serious discussions with all of you about this is an online event, and there are many people in the audience watching this event, and I really would like for many people to be aware of this serious discussion about international cooperation and the liberal economic restoration getting started. So this is the start of a Tokyo Conference 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'd like to have some opening remarks from Mr. Kato Katsunobu, Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japan. He has sent us a video message. Just a moment, please. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Katsunobu Kato, Chief Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to extend my sincere congratulations on holding of this Tokyo Conference 2021. I'd like to express my sincere respect to the organizer at Genron NPO, who have worked so hard to make this conference possible despite the constraints imposed by the new coronavirus infection. The international community is now facing major changes and challenges. First, there is this crisis caused by the global spread of the new coronavirus. Then there are the challenges to the universal values and international order that have underpinned the peace prosperity of the international community that have emerged in the face of the drastic changes in the balance of power in the international community and the emergence of new challenges such as globalization, digitalization, climate change, and other global issues and economic security. In this context, it is imperative that we overcome this crisis through international cooperation based on universal values such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. I believe that this timely the Tokyo Conference 2021 will focus on the restoration of international cooperation and democracy. In Japan, we are convinced that a free and open order based on the rule of law will bring peace and prosperity to the region and to the world. Ticket 6 in 2016, Japan proposed the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, a concept that is now shared by many countries. I believe it is becoming increasingly important and significant in the post-pandemic era. Japan is determined to work closely with the United States, Australia, India, ASEAN, also with Europe and Africa, and to take concrete steps to strategically promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. On March 12th, at the first ever summit meeting of the leaders of Japan, the United States, Australia, and we confirmed that the Quad will work closely together to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific. Japan will also emphasize multilateralism, actively contribute to resolving challenges facing the international community, and take lead in setting the rules for the post-pandemic international order. One of the most important issues is the recovery of the world economy, which has been severely depressed by the pandemic. There is a danger that the corona crisis will reinforce the protectionism and inward-looking attitudes that we have seen for some time. New challenges have also emerged, including conflicts over technological hegemony, supply chain for critical goods, and cybersecurity. In this context, it is important to expand the free and fair economic sphere and to maintain and strengthen the multilateral free trade system. Japan is determined to work firmly for WTO reform, the early entry into force of the RCEP agreement, and the steady implementation and expansion of the TPP-11. At the same time, we will deepen close cooperation between industry, government, and academia, and work with like-minded countries to ensure economic security. For a better economic and social recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, digitalization and the realization of a decarbonized society are important issues. In the digital field, we will promote the Osaka Track, launched at the G20 Osaka Summit, internationally to accelerate the creation of rules for data free flow with trust. In the area of climate change, we will announce an ambitious 2030 target by COP26 and work closely with other countries to make progress in decarbonizing the world. In conclusion, I would like to wish all the experts from around the world a lively debate and a meaningful exchange of views over the next 2 days. Congratulations to all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kato. Next, member of Genron NPO Advisory Board and former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, Ambassador Yasushi Akashi, is going to give his remarks. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. As you know, the head of Genron NPO is Mr. Yasushi Kudo. And I'd like to speak on behalf of the advisory board of the Genron NPO in Japan. First of all, let me wish you a warm welcome who are participating mostly online in this Tokyo Conference 2021. I wish to offer a very warm welcome on behalf of this advisory board for your participation in this 2-day discussion. This conference of 10 democracies in the world, large and small, started in 2017 and has been held every year since. This year, we are holding it under the theme, how do we restore the liberal economic order, democracy, and international cooperation? Since the beginning of last year, the world has been under the dark shadow of COVID-19. We have fortunately come around with several countries developing effective vaccines capable of countering this pandemic. The present pandemic exceeds that of Spanish flu, which was rampant 100 years ago. It reminds us of far more deadly pandemics of the earlier periods, which destroyed even civilizations and social systems of those days. The World Health Organization, or WHO, has been useful as a specialized agency of the United Nations system, but so far not capable of rooting out the pandemic as a whole. At this point, several individual states are producing and or distributing more than enough vaccines to their constituencies. The question before us is how the world can be brought together to organize itself with a single-minded determination, values based on liberalism and accepting democratic principles. In order to achieve that, we need to bring together both developed and developing countries, as well as large and small, and stop blaming one another for spreading this disease. Moreover, the big powers have to stop criticizing each other for having a hidden scheme of some kind to destroy the other side. In this connection, I'm glad to read an article on the top page of the New York Times today, criticizing Anchorage remarks made by the Secretary of State, which sounded to some of us more like those of Mr. Trump. I'm very pleased that a number of notable thinkers and think tanks have been brought together here for the purpose of the conference. Before COVID-19 emerged as the latest threat to mankind as a whole, democracies have had to face populism at home, which was brought into being in many different parts of the world by economic or social forces of different kinds. At this point in time, we have to restore the great vision of globalism, which brought the United Nations into being in 1945. During its 76-year history, the United Nations had to experience 45 years of antagonism between the Soviet Union and the United States before facing a new era in 1980, in which it had 10 years of successful and not so successful experiments of peacekeeping operations at the outset, before settling into the present 20 years of what I call pragmatism, following the famed Brahimi report of August 2000. What we need today, in my opinion, is a new globalism under the banner of the United Nations, but without unfounded assumptions or false expectations, but inspired by new approaches and imaginations by all of us. In short, we should be motivated by a renewed spirit of international collaboration with a shared feeling of approaching new dangers as well as opportunities. inspired by our conviction that we can act together under the banner of Sustainable Development Goals, so-called SDGs, proclaimed by the General Assembly in the year 2015. Instead of resorting to familiar rivalries or the hostilities towards neighbors or desires for superiority, we should be uniting under these new banners, which seem to be more appropriate for today's world. In brief, we have to move from the traditional adherence to national sovereignty to genuine international collaboration, instead of just following superpowers. We should pay great attention to public opinion when they are well-informed and intelligent, but not biased or uneducated ones. I hope our today's discussions will usher in a new multilateralism born of the recent threat to the humanity as a whole, through all kinds of diseases now and old, as well as all political ambitions known throughout human history. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
Last week, the Genron NPO conducted a questionnaire which is about international cooperation and democracy. And Mr. Kudo would like to introduce to you the results of that questionnaire survey. So about this questionnaire survey, this is a survey that is very much needed for the following discussions. And we asked a question about the restoration of the liberal economic order, democracy, and international cooperation. With that purpose, we conducted a survey. And this survey was conducted in the past week, so it was a kind of emergency survey, and around 150 responses we obtained. And the majority of the people or the respondents in Japan have high expectation of the Biden administration in terms of the restoration of international cooperation and protection of democracy. And in terms of the international cooperation as well, the Biden administration work together with allies and friends. More than 70% of the people think the restoration of international cooperation is possible, and more than half of the people think that the Biden administration can demonstrate leadership in protecting democracy. However, when it comes to the liberal economic order, whether the Biden administration is going to set to restore such order or not, the opinions are divided. But in terms of the leadership for the global governance, whether the US is going to go back to the leadership role, we do not have very high expectation coming from the Japanese experts, and this is below 40%. And people think that no country can demonstrate such leadership in terms of global governance when it comes to the confront the US. The experts in Japan do not think that this situation of confrontation would not change just because of the new administration of President Biden. And what is very important for our following discussions is about how we assess the global response to this pandemic. So Japanese experts think that if there is another pandemic in the future, learning from lessons of this coronavirus, only 20% of the people think that the world can have appropriate response to the pandemic, which means that the world is not going to learn lessons from this pandemic. And we have failed to respond to the pandemic appropriately, according to many people's views. And as Mr. Akashi also touched upon, the role of the United Nations in terms of the response to the crisis of the humanity, more than 60% of the people think the United Nations are not appropriately responding to such crisis of humanity. And in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, in terms of crisis response, there was a very much different response. Could be better in terms of response to such crisis, but 60% of the experts here in Japan think that is not actually the case, but around 20% of the experts actually agreed with that idea. So what about in crisis management or global response in such a crisis? What is needed for democracies in terms of responding to such global crisis? Trust in the government as well as in the political leaders, that has to be restored. That was expressed by the majority of the people. And democracies need to come up with an appropriate system in terms of crisis management. There was a lack of such crisis management system in the governance here in Japan as well. That's been observed. And also there was some proposal made to citizens. So citizens should not only focus on their freedoms, they need to cooperate and contribute to the society as a whole response to such a pandemic. So this survey was done for the purpose of the follow-up discussions, and there are other things that we covered in the questionnaire, but there are certain things we can learn from this questionnaire, and I hope that this benefits the follow-up discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So this concludes the opening session. So we will now move on to the first session. And the panelists for the first session, so from 4 countries and from the UK too, I think everybody is ready. So everyone please switch on your video, those participants in the first session. And the first session's title is Can the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy Protect Peace in Asia? So this is going to be a 90-minute session. So since everybody in the first session is ready, so we will start the first session. So let me introduce our panelists. First of all, from the US, Daniel Russel. From India, former Prime Minister Special Envoy for Disarmament and Non-proliferation, Rakesh Sood. From Australia, Australia, Rory Medcalf, yes. Head of the National Security College, Australian National University. Next. And from countries other than Quad, John Nelson Wright, Senior Research Fellow at the Chatham House. And from ASEAN, from Singapore, from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, On Ken Yong. And the Japanese participant, former Commander-in-Chief, the Self-Defense Fleet in Japan, Mr. Yoji Koda. And at the end of this session, we will take your questions from the participants who are participating through Zoom. Please use the chat function and to pose your, submit your questions in English. So let's start this session. Our moderator is Mr. Sanjay Josh, Observer Research Foundation in India. Mr. Josh, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be participating in the Tokyo conference in spite of doing it virtually. I'm especially important for me because I remember the last time I traveled was actually to the Tokyo conference last year. I haven't traveled after that. All the meetings I've been having are virtually on Zoom. So it's in the fitness of things that 2021 we are having the Tokyo conference also on Zoom. It has been, I think, very creditable for Kudo-san to organize this conference again. It's an event we look forward to year after year. It's a chance to meet old colleagues and new ones. This time, we are meeting virtually, but let us make the most of it. We heard two excellent opening remarks, which have laid out, the signs, the caution signs on the road ahead in the post-pandemic world which you're facing. We also just saw the interim national security guidance released by the White House recently, which openly calls China the only competitor potentially capable of combining its economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to mount a sustained challenge to a stable and open international system. There are shades of the Trump era in that. So the questions which the organizers have really posed for this particular session, whether the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy will be able to protect peace in Asia, or is it setting up the region for a protracted and uncertain conflict with China, the consequences of which practically everybody in the region is extremely wary of. The point is, that for both its detractors as well as cheerleaders, it does not seem very obvious what the end objective of the Indo-Pacific or of the Quad is, and how it is going to develop into the future. On the one hand, the Quad's function against China has gained much attention from the rest of the world. Yet countries in the region and even some participants in the Quad seem to be rather cautious of giving the impression that it is a kind of ganging up of democracies against China intended to spur greater tension. The point is that as the US-China trade war continued and was then followed by the pandemic, the world did see the emergence of a new belligerent China, a belligerent China that seemed to be wanting to give the impression that it had done with hiding its strength and biding its time, and was now ready to no longer hide, but willing to show the big stick it carries. At a time when the strongest in the world are struggling to contain a global was seeking in the pandemic an opportunity to burn out its regional rivals. So we have experts on the region from the 4 countries of the Quad and others in the room. So I'm going to give our main panelists, I would say, make your remarks in about 8 minutes. Let me begin with Admiral Yoji Koda. In the first 2+2 talks, which have been held between Japan and the US, both have pledged to strengthen their alliance in response to shared concerns over the aggressive actions which I just spoke about. And as I said, this is at a time when countries are struggling to recover. China has actually increased its defense budget by 6.8% to almost US dollars 210 billion. It's commissioned 25 million new ships. It has 70 Yang-2 class frigates designed to operate in the shallow waters of the Taiwan Straits. For Japan, this does pose an ever-present existential security threat. Now, what do you think, Admiral Koda? What is your view on this? And do you feel that other countries in the Quad look at it in the very same way? Over to you, Admiral.
Sunjoy, thank you very much. And you asked me a kind of the surprising question. So I thought only Japan was very good at making surprise, but I just learned India is too good at the surprise. But say putting those the secondary things aside, the Quad is still a conceptual body. And so there's no concrete, for example, the military agreements or, the political or strategic alignment among four nations. But one thing true is, say, for example, the democracy or freedom or international cooperation posture is in jeopardy now because of the challenge of the newcomers, especially the China. So we have to do our best effort to really repair these scars. And also we have to re-establish our common values, democracy and freedom, or the human rights, or international cooperation. And now I promised with our interpreters that I'm going to speak in Japanese language. So now I'm going to speak in Japanese language. I have mainly 4 short subjects. One is
Sorry. So first is how we should understand China. That's the first topic. So we, as China becomes richer, we expected China to come to agreement to international agreements, but since 2016, as China becomes even stronger and richer, China, in terms of the international system, international norms, they do not have high regard for them, or they do not want to be incorporated in existing international systems and go its own way. That's our impression. And in many cases, the case of Hong Kong, for example, the China disregarded the pledge he made, Mr. Xi Jinping made to Mr. Obama on the non-militarization of the South China Sea. So they broke a very important international promise, and we witnessed that. So in the future, how can we expect China to also respect the values that we hold very high, such as democracy and freedom? And we just have to be very negative about that, pessimistic about that. But at the same time, and so I'm coming to the second point, but the difference between China and the countries participating in Quad, we cannot resolve them by military power, and it is not right either. The diplomacy and politics should be deployed in order to cope with China. and to have a very good communications between China and the Quad countries. That should not be avoided. We should not go very easily to resort to military power. And the third point, so in this situation, one of the hopes, maybe we can say, is that in the 4 years of Trump administration, the U.S. Was, America first, and they even, paid little regard for its allies. So it has now changed to Biden administration, who pledges that he will work with allies and international community to resolve the issues. And one of the biggest issues for the international community is China's challenge to democracy, freedom, and human rights and others. To put it more simply, so the democracy, freedom, and the humanitarianism and international cooperation, those against the authoritarianism or excessive central government system. So there is a conflict between those two. So the question is how we should try to close the gaps between the two who are very different. So in that sense, already, in terms of the US-China trade war, I use the word war, but it's already becoming quite evident this high technology and intellectual property and other areas of the conflict between the US and China will go on for quite some time in the future. And as Mr. Akashi said, referred to this article on the New York Times today, and this response by Mr. Blinken reminds us of the Trump administration, according to New York Times. So when you are faced with this high-handed situation of China, to what extent can we still keep this palliative approach to China? Because in the past, we know that China did not pledge its own words, keep its own words, or in international negotiations, when we were concessive, they were quite aggressive, or they did not, keep their promises, as I said in the beginning. So on this front, the Japan, US, Australia, and India, who share the same values of freedom and democracy, we should get united and draw on our wisdom in order to cope with China. And lastly, so as I said, that there is a need for gathering all the wisdom we all have. But lastly, this overwhelming buildup of the military power of China, that's what we are facing, especially Japan and ASEAN countries just sit right next to China. So we directly feel this pressure coming from China. So as a last resort, against this military challenge from China, to what extent we should build our own capacity and abilities. That's something that we should also bear in mind. So those are the 4 points that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for that intervention, Admiral Koda. Yes, as you said, the world does have a China dilemma. And to explore that further, let me push Rory a bit further. Rory, you are the one in the room who is credited with having written the first definitive guide to what has been called the world's most contested region. And you also call your guide the Indo-Pacific Empire. I mean, the notion of empire makes it less a place, more an idea. So what is the Indo-Pacific? Whose empire is it if it's an empire? Or is it capable of being a free and open shared space which will reinforce the international order? How do you see this evolving in the future?
Thank you, Sunjoy. And I just should add that it's a real pleasure to be here, and I have a lot of respect for our host organisation, so and for the work they do. So thank you for including me as an Australian voice in this conversation. So I guess I want to share two thoughts with all of you, and the first is to address your question, Sunjoy, to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific and why I think, whether we like it or not, the Indo-Pacific is the framework now for understanding the dynamics of risk, of peace, of crisis, of potential conflict. This is the regional framework we will be working in for some years to come. What is it? I think the Indo-Pacific means many things to many people, but I do think that it is a place as well as an idea and a basis for strategy. I think it's a conception of a two-ocean system that the region is increasingly engaged in, a system that reflects the changing patterns of connectivity, for example, infrastructure, the geoeconomics. The whole fact of China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, suggests that even though China criticizes the term Indo-Pacific, it's actually living an Indo-Pacific policy. The rise and the frictions among many powers, I mean, the relationship, for example, between China and India adds another Indo-Pacific dynamic. The interests of so many of the countries that we are interested in, China, Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, the Southeast Asian partners, as well as the United States, all of those interests rely very heavily on the maritime connectivity of the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Pacific. And importantly, all of the shocks and crises of COVID in the past 12 months have not fundamentally altered this picture. In fact, we're seeing in many ways an acceleration of a lot of the frictions around Chinese power because of, I think, China's overconfidence arising from its response to COVID, because of the uncertainties about the United States under Donald Trump, but now the re-engagement of the Biden administration more comprehensively with the region. And finally, because of the very creative middle power diplomacy we're seeing from so many other countries to build new coalitions of partnership across the Indo-Pacific. The Quad is one of those, but also partnerships without the United States, Australia, India, and Japan, Australia, India, and France, Australia, India, and Indonesia, a few examples from the Australian side of things. So my first point is just to emphasize that character of the Indo-Pacific and the fact that although it is in many ways a response to the extension of Chinese power, it's also, I think, a proactive self-selecting movement by middle powers and regional powers to try to create balance. And the United States re-engaging the way I believe the Biden administration is doing so, and look at their diplomacy in recent weeks, and look at the way that the Quad has repositioned itself for the common good on vaccine and other issues, I think that these are signs that it's going to be a long and challenging contest now in the Indo-Pacific. And we hope, and I say we because I think I reflect the views certainly of colleagues in Australia, but also I think the middle powers in this conversation. The hope is that through the right calibration of balancing, not confrontation, but balancing, in time, China will accept a kind of settling point for its ambitions. And to answer your question before I move to say a few brief things about peace and conflict, to answer your question, Sunjoy, my book, which in fact I conveniently have here to just mention, refers to the notion of empire, not because there's anything I think worthy about imperial ambition in the Indo-Pacific, but because in many ways we are seeing some quasi-imperial, quasi-colonial characteristics in the way China has expanded influence across the region, not just military power, but geopolitical influence. And in many ways that has not, I fear, learned the lessons yet of the imperial experience of other countries. And as we know, every empire that seeks to dominate a region as vast and complex and diverse and multipolar as the Indo-Pacific ultimately overstretches. To conclude my remarks, I would just say that what can an Indo-Pacific strategy contribute to peace and security in the region? That's a conversation I think we should have if there's time in the question and answer session. But I think it's important to define that an Indo-Pacific strategy is something that our countries now have the agency to shape. It does not have to be pure confrontation or pure containment. It's not the pure Trump version of Indo-Pacific strategy. I think it can be much more balanced, including deterrence, but also including diplomacy, development, solidarity among democracies, and ultimately national resilience. And I do think we are at the beginning of a long game to achieve those things. And I certainly think that Japan has a crucial role to play. I'll leave it there and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. Ambassador Sood, Rory just said that the Indo-Pacific strategy, the new Indo-Pacific strategy is about balance. Now, has the new Indo-Pacific strategy, the Quad meeting has just concluded, the virtual Quad meeting. And in the virtual Quad meeting, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said the Quad has come of age. Now, does that mean the Quad has actually settled down to a more balanced strategy? Or does it simply mean that India is no longer reluctant to work with other members of the Quad? They were hitherto, it kept them at a distance. It spoke about regional autonomy, strategic autonomy. Has the Indian attitude changed, or has the Quad changed to become a much more balanced framework? Or what are your views?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sanjay. And let me first of all just say that it is a pleasure to be here engaging with old friends like Rory and listening to my old colleague Yasushi-san, who just delivered the keynote, who was the Under-Secretary General for Disarmament in the UN many, many years ago. And so it is a delight to be focusing on this particular subject. And I think the first point I'd like to make is that the growth of the concept of the Indo-Pacific and its acceptance is linked organically with the notion of the Quad. Let me put it like this, that if the concept of the Indo-Pacific had not gained currency, I don't think the Quad would have achieved its current shape. Because if you look at it together, you find that when it first happened, post-tsunami, it was a maritime-led, these were 4 countries. Again, there was something organic that happened. When Prime Minister Abe spoke about it in 2007, he was linking it in a historical sense. I mean, I must say, it was a very visionary kind of a thing, because even in his speech in the parliament in Delhi, when he talked of the Indo-Pacific, he recalled a book of the 17th century written by a Mughal prince, Dara Shikoh. So he was kind of looking at it in terms of cultural, civilizational influences. When it got revived again, it was, the world had changed, perceptions had changed. And in this process, the Quad came into more of a shape and took on a more concrete shape. And I think what we have seen is, therefore, with the first summit, we also saw one more remarkable new development, which was for the first time a joint statement. In the past, we had not had joint statements. And what was remarkable about this was, because I think it reflected the acceptance of a very major new reality on the part of all the members of the Quad, which is that there has to be a positive agenda. So therefore, you know, the Chinese have been traditionally dismissive about it, calling it sea foam, which will dissipate. And when they have been critical about it, they have called it the equivalent of an Asian NATO. The fact is, it is neither. It is a hybrid. But then today's world deals with hybrid threats. So therefore, perhaps you need a hybrid structure, which is part allies and part partners, which is part maritime and part amphibian, which is part deterrence and part diplomatic, and so on. And so this is why it is important. And I think the two defining attributes of the Quad as it moves forward, because this is just the beginning, the two defining attributes of the Quad as it is going to move forward is that it will have to be both flexible in its organizational approaches, and it will have to be resilient in terms of building capabilities of working together. These are going to be the two hallmarks for the Quad if it has to do justice, because if the term, as Rory reminded us, the term Indo-Pacific has come to stay, and this is going to be the way we are going to define our strategic framework, our diplomatic framework in this region, then I think the Quad to play a role in bringing together the Indo-Pacific, in leading it towards the question that you said of contributing to peace and development and security in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad has to be both flexible, which means the ability to work with countries as and when it is possible, and at the same time resilient in terms of developing a certain capability of working together, of norms, of practices, of best practices, and so on. And that, I think, is critical. As Admiral Yoda also reminded us right at the outset, it is conceptual. And I think when we try and look at it in the context of the Cold War, in terms of containment, in terms of an Asian NATO, I think we do not adequately appreciate both the idea of the two oceans, and we try and look at it in terms of threat perceptions that existed during NATO, which was the Fulda Gap and a single dividing line between East and West and all of that. So that notion is what we carry over from the past when we try to use that kind of a terminology. So that is why the best way, the way I look at it is that a hybrid, the nature of hybrid threats requires hybrid solutions, and the Quad has to be a successful hybrid solution in today's age in order to do justice and play its role in contributing to peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. You spoke of the hybrid nature of Quad. You spoke of a balanced approach, which has finally found its feet in the Quad. Let me turn to Daniel. Daniel, I just read your piece, I think in the Diplomat, where you've spoken of how the new administration has moved away from what was coming closer and closer to a new Cold War a few months ago. And you insist that the point is no longer to force countries to choose between China and the United States. It's to ensure that countries have viable choices and the ability to decide for themselves. Is that correct? It's not a view which is shared. You spoke. We heard as Akashi speak. There were some apprehensions about what it means. What did the Secretary's advice mean when he spoke about China in the terms he did? What does the guidance note say about China? So, and the first question is that true? And the other question then is, what is the Quad then doing to suggest that it is indeed the better choice?
Well, thanks, Sanjay. These are great questions, and thanks to Kudo-san and Genron for including me in the Tokyo conference. Look, first of all, the Indo-Pacific region is absolutely critical to America's security and economic future, and therefore, any responsible government in Washington has to care, has to be actively engaged in shaping the development of the region. So when we look at some of the differences between the previous administration and the Biden administration, we have to admit that the retreat from regional engagement and leadership was a catastrophic mistake. And that mistake has given authoritarian systems an unprecedented opportunity to exert influence, to discredit democracy. It emboldened others to challenge international rules and values and standards and institutions. It eroded norms, deterrence, and so on. So on the question of the free and open Indo-Pacific, and on the question of the Quad, and whether they fit a strategy that serves the interests of the countries in the region, let me start with the Indo-Pacific, which is more than a geographic construct. Different people use different language to characterize it, but I think the basic concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific is clear just through common sense. It means good governance, democratic systems that respect the rights and reflect the will of the citizens, protection of basic freedoms, governments that respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, the rights of weaker neighbors, that honor the spirit and letter of the UN Charter, adhere to international law, and so on. It's a region with open markets and the free flow of goods, people, data, ideas, safeguards for intellectual property, impartial courts that will uphold the sanctity of contracts and protect the weaker party in disputes. So the goal is clearly a region that is stable, that's secure, that's unthreatened by aggression or coercive threats, that promotes innovation, entrepreneurship, gives opportunities to citizens to improve their standard of living through education. And look, a region that's resilient in the face of natural disasters and pandemics and climate change. So in sum, I think the proponents of a free and open Indo-Pacific are trying to create a region that's modeled more on Japan or Australia or India than on China or North Korea. And I know that sounds idealistic, but any sports coach will tell you, visualizing success helps you to enable it. You asked about the Quad, and look, I'll be frank, in the past, I was no admirer of the Quad because I thought it existed more as a talking point than as a reality. And at various points over the last decade and a half, each of the four countries at one point seemed to lose interest in it. There were meetings usually at low levels, no summits, only 2 ministerials. And as Ambassador Sood pointed out, no statements. But in the last 4 years, the Trump administration talked up the Quad like it was NATO, like it was aimed right at China's heart. And the results were predictable. China was determined to counter it. ASEAN disliked it. And many, including in our four countries, had qualms about it. My point is, Joe Biden seems to have changed all that. The Quad is really Quad 2.0 now. It's organized around what the four democracies believe is needed to support a secure and a prosperous region. And Look, it's true, as Admiral Koda said, that there's no underlying political or military treaty. But the summit on March 12th rolled out a really impressive vaccine distribution plan in which each of the 4 countries contributes what it can do best. It explicitly commits them to an in-person Quad summit before the end of the year, to ministerial meetings once or more a year. It creates 3 working groups with senior officials and clearly defined missions and timelines. So it seems clear now that the Quad 2.0 is going to have more significance, more staying power, because the 4 countries are combining their relative strengths and coordinating their approach to real challenges. And that the Quad has found a purpose, an affirmative set of goals and ambitions, as Ambassador Sood said, not just an anti-China message. And that should be reassuring to ASEAN and to others. So the Quad 2.0 is clearly a valuable mechanism for coordination among the 4, and eventually with others on a range of issues. And I think Joe Biden seems determined to configure the Quad, not just for policy coordination, but for coordinated action on an array of regional challenges, and do it in a way that can bring in other countries. So all that said, to me, the Quad is only one unit of many in a rich, what I call geopolitical geometry, that includes the US, Japan, Korea trilateral alliance cooperation, the US, Japan, Australia trilateral security dialogue, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Plus, Pacific Island Forum, and so on. These sort of mini-laterals are supplemented, of course, by a network of diplomatic connections and projects. Some of them focused on particular challenges. Take the old 6-party talks, for example. So I don't expect China to stop complaining anytime soon that the Quad is an anti-China bloc, that it's unfairly ganging up on China, trying to contain China. Casting itself as the innocent victim is very much a part of Chinese propaganda. But it's an unjustified, it's a self-serving argument that rings hollow, especially now that bombastic officials like Mike Pompeo are out of office in the US. The Biden approach is not the Trump approach. The Biden interim national security strategy is not the Trump national security strategy. And although Biden calls out Chinese misconduct bluntly, he's not framing China as an evil empire to be contained. He's not calling for the Chinese government to be overthrown. Instead, he's signaling his determination to outcompete China and to do it with partners, not alone. And so he's building out the Quad as a more reliable, safer partner that offers appealing alternatives and extends practical help to the region. So in sum, my answer to the broad question that Kudo-san posed is simple. Yeah, I think that the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and the rebirth of the Quad are indeed serving the interests of peace in the region. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. That was extremely valuable. The Biden administration approach, you insist, is very different from the previous administrations. Let us get to a view from ASEAN. Ambassador Yong, the ASEAN has generally been very wary of being forced to choose between the US and China. Now, does the concept that the Quad 2.0, first of all, you agree that this is Quad 2.0, and then does it give you assurance that this is no longer being about forcing countries to choose? But then related to that is the difference between nudging them to choose, forcing them to choose. How much is the difference? What are your views?
Hi, thank you, Sanjay. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Yeah.
Perfectly.
Well, I think the Quad 1.0 or Quad 2.0 really does not matter very much for us in ASEAN, because I think what ASEAN is trying to do is to navigate the best way we can among our own self, our member states. There are 10 of us in Southeast Asia. Yeah. And also among those big countries and major powers which have interest in Southeast Asia. So when we look at Quad, the starting point was the terrible tsunami and earthquake which hit us 2 decades ago. And we saw the big countries, major powers coming together to organize their humanitarian disaster relief and trying to rebuild those countries badly hit by the natural disaster. And I think if you look at the outcome of that exercise, it confirmed 2 things. One, whatever the countries, whatever the government, we can work together if we have a unity of purpose. Yeah. And 2, when we have to do certain things like this, humanitarian disaster or what have you in these days, pandemic, I think we have to avoid too much of ideology or politics. The important thing is to save lives and move on to secure the future. So when ASEAN look at Quad, some people are happy that now we have a 2.0 Quad, but others are worrying about what does this mean for the traditional way in which we promote interaction among ourselves in Southeast Asia and between Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. So if it is taken as a mechanism to manage the so-called aggressive Chinese diplomacy, or to have it as a mechanism to retain US presence and influence in the region, then I don't think we are going to go very far. Yeah. However, if we take it that it is a process to engage everyone with an interest to have a prosperous and peaceful Southeast Asia, East Asia, Indo-Pacific, I think there will be a chance for us to do something positive and constructive. So, yeah, I think now we have the mechanics being put in place, but the next stage is to develop more trust among Quad partners, among Quad plus others. The name really doesn't matter. For us in ASEAN, you know, Sunjoy, we are always accused of being very promiscuous. Our countries, our member states make friends with anybody. And we end up with so many complicated diplomatic initiatives, but somehow, yeah, ASEAN has proven to be relatively useful for the Southeast Asian region. And now, of course, we look at the developments, we say that ASEAN should be useful and cooperative with all partners in the Indo-Pacific. So let's see how these things evolve. I don't want to engage in the discussion whether it is anti-China or pro-US, but I think overall what ASEAN is looking for is the ability to develop more meaningful platform where we can engage each other and find a way to bring back trust in a manner that is conducive for what Genron MPO is trying to do in this session, this conference, which is to restore the liberal world order, especially with regard to promoting our economic growth and multilateralism. I will stop here, Sunjoy.
Thank you, Ambassador Yong. I agree with you that, you know, ASEAN has for long learned the hard way. You know, it's learned to look beyond the vicissitudes of great power rivalries and to forge its own pathway, whether you call it promiscuous or whatever it is, but it's about forging your own pathway. They learned it through the days of the Cold War. They've learned it through the days of the trade war. Thomas, let me come to you now. The view from Europe. Does the Quad make sense to Europe? Or let me put it another way, have the last 4 years only driven the same learning which ASEAN has about that, you need, when the transatlantic consensus wilted under Trump, then France, Germany, Netherlands started coming out with their own Indo-Pacific strategies. The EU has also been discussing a joint strategy for the Indo-Pacific. The Germany clearly spelled out its concern that a new bipolarity with fresh dividing lines across the Indo-Pacific was clearly seen as inimical to German interests. Now, what is the view from Europe and what is the view specifically from France? What is your concept of the Indo-Pacific seen in the much broader context of Eurasia and even Africa? What is the Indo-Pacific? Thomas, do we have you? I can't see Thomas.
Sanjay, John is on. John from Chatham House.
Okay, let me pass on to John. Okay, John, let me come to you.
Sunjoy. Well, let me start by saying it's a great privilege to be here, and for obvious reasons, with Britain having taken the momentous step of leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom, of course, can't claim to. I'm getting some interference. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, good. The United Kingdom obviously finds itself in an unusual position, having to decide how best to position itself globally. And you'll know that, of course, with the recent publication of the government's integrated review, Britain has been in a position to kind of reassess the extent to which its global posture now needs to be firmly linked to participation in Asia. Some of that we're already seeing very demonstrably with Britain's application to join CPTPP. I think there is a clear recognition that the economic importance of Asia is undeniable. Whether it's sufficient, of course, to compensate for the very real costs of leaving the European Union, I think it would be overly optimistic to see the Asian dimension as really adequately compensating. But there is an aspiration, there is an ambition. But there is a debate at the same time going on in the United Kingdom about what it means to be a global actor. Simon Fraser, formerly the Permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office, said a few years ago in testimony to the House of Lords International Affairs Committee that the idea of global Britain is a concept that is still insufficiently filled out in terms of material commitments. And I was struck by the earlier discussion about public opinion, because it seems to me that one of the critical issues that all of our countries, particularly middle powers, have to face is how do you engage domestic opinion in support of these bold, ambitious agendas. It was Jake Sullivan in 2019, writing in The Atlantic, who made the point that foreign policy needs to be much more closely tied to the interests of the middle class. And that seems to be really powerful when it comes to countries that are still grappling to find a place on the international stage. There is, I think, a polarization of views within the United Kingdom and a profound distrust of government, including the Johnson administration, on the back of the Brexit trauma. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe it as having those sorts of political repercussions. Our Prime Minister has made a great deal of the fact that HMS Queen Elizabeth II will be deployed to the region across the Indo-Pacific, which of course has real symbolic impact in terms of demonstrating Britain's commitment to the region. But it raises, I think, a very important question of how you persuade people that this is both financially sustainable and will have a material impact in terms of enhancing security. And that, I think, brings me to the kind of question of values, because in the Biden administration's description of its new strategic approach, it's talked about the world being at an inflection point. And while it's, I think, really important to draw the distinctions between the Cold War and the current situation, there is a kind of rhetorical push in this rhetoric to talk about a moment of real significant change. If we're engaging with the question of how do you, in fact, persuade public opinion that it's kind of a legitimate argument to say that countries like the United Kingdom and others should be designed and focused on promoting democracy? How do you persuade people that the cost is worth bearing? And my final point, which sort of picks up on some of the observations that Rory made in his, it's true to say that middle power diplomacy now and middle power initiatives are a demonstration of enhanced flexibility and the appetite for engagement. How do you harmonize different middle power initiatives? If one takes the case of Southeast Asia and one thinks of South Korea's new Southern policy, clearly having real benefits because it's allied with the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. But many of us are concerned about the absence of effective cooperation between other middle powers, such as Japan, in the same region, which leads us to the other issue that we haven't really talked much about, which is the extent to which the legacy of colonialism, disputes over historical interpretation, are standing as an obstacle to more enhanced cooperation between middle powers. That's something I think that not only Japan and South Korea have to grapple with, but countries like the United Kingdom, which has its own close relationship with both Seoul and Tokyo, also need to think about in terms of facilitating dialogue and acting in a way that Robert Niblett, the head of Chatham House, has made a case for, I think, recently, acting as a convening role, acting as a broker. And with Britain chairing the G7, of course, that's a particular role that countries like Britain could play. But that requires common agreement on the agenda. And that brings me back to this question of democracy. What does it mean to enhance democracy globally when it is arguably at threat domestically in some of those countries that are making that argument perhaps most strongly of all? Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you for that intervention. Now, let me just throw one quick round where each one will have about 3 minutes each to respond. I'm throwing a question to all the panelists and the discussants. You know, and at the conclusion of the Quad, there have been multiple ideas for technology coalitions to reduce current Western dependence on China. There were 2 initiatives unveiled at the Quad Summit, the working group on critical technologies and the vaccine initiative to supply Southeast Asia. They all underline the prospects for reconfiguring supply chains. The point is it so easy to reconfigure the supply chains? I mean, there is, I think, a real dilemma there. And at the root of this dilemma lies this conundrum about trying to find a solution to China that does not involve China. Is that possible in 2020? That may have been possible in an alternative universe where 1972 never happened, in which the world has spent almost half a century trying to involve China already. So how is decoupling possible? How do you find the solution? What are your responses? John, can I start with you? Let's do it in the reverse order. Just 3 minutes.
I mean, very quickly, I think, we see this dilemma being confronted by Japan, right? In terms of its government support for incentivizing these corporations to relocate either back to Japan or to Southeast Asia to reduce that dependency on supply chains. I mean, I think the basic starting point is to recognize the importance of not framing the relationship with zero-sum terms. And reflecting on anchorage, of course, I mean, while the rhetoric may have been very confrontational on both sides, and the New York Times article, I think, is right to point that out, it's important that the parties meet on a regular basis, not just in terms of the symbolic importance, but the opportunity to share views and ideas. Japan, of course, is still looking for the delayed visit of Xi Jinping to Japan. We should be thinking in terms of more of that dialogue, more of those opportunities to enhance high-level collaboration, but also, again, to echo this point about incentivizing people to support these sorts of initiatives, to broaden the contact in terms of person-to-person exchanges. Again, sitting here in the United Kingdom in Cambridge, one thing that we're very conscious of is the importance of the higher education sector. And it's very easy to imagine that with China's financial impact and its ability to lure foreign talent to China as part of its own industrial policy, if you like, there is a danger that even in the educational space, this will be framed as an adversarial relationship. So how we think cleverly and creatively about sustaining collaborative academic enterprises while safeguarding intellectual property seems to be a really pressing issue. I don't have any easy solutions, but it is something which will become the middle powers, I think, increasingly important issue about how we pool resources and include China within that framework.
Ambassador, what is the ASEAN has very well integrated into the Chinese manufacturing framework. And ASEAN has been, it's one of the largest trading partners which China has. And what is your view on this whole concept of creating alternative supply chains?
Thank you, Sunjoy. I think the most important thing for us in ASEAN is that we don't believe that you can really separate whatever we have so far in terms of the supply chain and what you commonly see in the media as decoupling of the various parts of the economy as we know it. Yeah. Sure, if you force it, you can decouple. Men and women can get a divorce, but it will be painful and everybody get harmed. So what we are worried about in ASEAN are two things. One, how are you going to decouple or separate one particular supply chain from another now that much of the operation and the manufacturing and services activities are integrated by digital platform, by internet. Yeah, we are not even talking about new technology. Just on the basis of what we have today, it's not so straightforward. Secondly, we in ASEAN, not like in Europe, we don't have a common currency. Where do we go? We base ourselves on US dollar in transacting business. Of course, more and more people in China would like us to use the Chinese currency. But at the end of the day, that would take a long time. And up till today, we talk about decoupling, having our own supply chain, having China plus one or other kind of technological detachment and development without thinking who pays for all this, yeah? And how do we transact business across national boundary with no alternative currency like the US dollar? I think it's going to be very challenging, but for Southeast Asian country, ASEAN country, we wish that we don't have to make such a big decision. Thank you.
Daniel, I come to you. We are talking of the new technology supply chains in the Quad, these have been discussed. The same question. Is it possible, or is Quad 2.0 actually different, that the technology war is about to end and there is going to be more harmonious working together? Or you spoke about competition, out-competing China. What is this competition about?
Thanks, Sanjay. Well, there's a huge spectrum of competition between the United States and China. Technology, which you've mentioned, is one. There's trade competition. There's security competition. There's also some ideological and systemic competition. I think there's a lot of confusion about the idea of decoupling, and I'm certainly not a fan of decoupling or even of the word. I think what the Biden administration is talking about is something different. One is the diversification of supply chains, ensuring that there are adequate options, such as to avoid being in a position of great vulnerability and complete dependence, because supply chains can be disrupted and they can be manipulated, as we have seen. The other is maintaining the integrity of systems as a matter of national security. I think the fundamental difference there between the Trump and the Biden administration is the Trump team took a broad brush approach, barring all products, et cetera, whereas the Biden team seems to use a scalpel and be very limited in what it excludes or controls. When you look at China, you see dual circulation really as an extension of the effort to create a dynamic where China has unrestricted access to the world, but denies access in most areas into China from the rest of the world. So you have to ask if China ever coupled really in the first place. I think the Quad outcomes are about much more than just supply chain. The focus on the working group looking at emerging technology is about spreading the technology, not about restricting. There's a working group aiming at promoting resilience. This is not a marketing effort. This is a collaborative and constructive effort to try to get at the genuine threat, particularly to Southeast Asia. So I think we should look much more broadly than the issue of decoupling or supply chains. I think the Quad is seeking to promote integration in policy areas, practical coordination among the four nations, as well as to integrate the four Quad members with the partner.
Thank you, Daniel. Ambassador Sood, what are your views on, I would say, the non-security dimensions of the Quad? You spoke about, the hybrid Quad, and here we are talking about non-security dimensions of the Quad. How many legs does the Quad have to run when you start talking of the non-security dimensions, where we talk of technology, we talk of vaccines? How far will it run?
Thank you, Sunjoy. I think, as an amphibian animal, it does not need to be limited to either a quadruped or a biped or anything like that. It can have as many legs as is needed. So I think that is exactly what I meant by both flexibility and resilience. But if we look at decoupling, and I agree with Danny when he said that don't look at decoupling in a narrow sense. See, if you look at decoupling and define it as dependence, then China started decoupling many years ago with its various programs of science and technology, the 1,000 talents and all of that, which were all geared to developing its own base, as it were, and thereby be less dependent on the West for this technology or things like that. I mean, we know all that. So in that sense, that part of decoupling is already in play, as it were. Secondly, the digital world, I'm afraid, there is already a divide. I mean, there is a large part. The Chinese firewall does exist in that sense. What I think is happening is that the China, look at it this way, it's a different world. Now, for example, China wants a bigger role for the RMB, as befits its status as the largest trading power and so on. But it also realizes that convertibility makes it a challenge and an issue. So therefore, how does China get around it? By talking of a virtual currency. So I think we have to find that is, now, just as China can be creative in terms of, so when we look at decoupling, we have to look at it in that sense. And that is how the Quad has to have multiple legs, which it will evolve as we go along, as the new challenges come up. I mean, the vaccine challenge is not a challenge. Suppose the Quad had happened 3 years ago. I'm quite sure that the vaccine issue would not have been would not have been so front and center. We will see more such challenges as they take place. And the other point I'd like to make is that I think we have to, all this will unfold against the backdrop of two things. One is the US, because without the US, you wouldn't have the Quad, because by themselves, neither Australia nor Japan nor India have the kind of capabilities that could span the Indo-Pacific. And without the growing Chinese assertiveness, we won't see the Quad taking its shape as it is. So while that will provide the backdrop against which the Quad will evolve, the Quad will have to develop its multiple legs as it proceeds forward. Thank you.
Rory, is the Quad big enough, comprehensive enough to take on all these challenges? Can it really mount a challenge to the BRI?
I would say with respect that the Quad is not going to be the answer to all of these challenges, and I don't think that even its most ardent advocates think that the Quad alone is the solution. I think it's part of the solution. Look, it depends which angle you come at this from. I would argue that diversification, I don't think it's decoupling, but for a country like Australia, it's diversification of our economic reliance, diversification of our supply chains, of our partners. That is happening. It's being driven in large part by China's economic coercion against Australia and against other countries. The Quad will be part of the answer of that, both for ourselves and for a range of partners in the region. My own college is now running a research project with Quad partners to begin mapping the potential for technology cooperation in cyber and critical technologies, and it's going to be incomplete. We need Europe very much in the mix. We need to look at other partners. We need to find a place for South Korea in all of this. And in the end, this is not about excluding China. It's really about China plus in our relationships. And yes, quarantining those parts of the economic relationship where China has chosen to weaponize our economic interdependence. So that's a long way of saying that the Quad will be part of the solution. And I guess where I hold out a lot of hope for the Quad is not as a hard block, but as a core for other flexible coalitions. What can the Quad do with Europe? What can the Quad do with France or Britain or Korea for that matter? Or indeed, what can the Quad do with partners in ASEAN? That's the conversation that's beginning. And I think the way the Biden administration led the reframing of the Quad a week ago is absolutely the right start to begin those conversations.
Admiral Koda, can I have your intervention on this?
So I'd like to speak about the Japanese position. Japan's position. Well, Japan, in terms of the security, regional security of the Indo-Pacific region, well, there is a US and Japan alliance treaty and then its framework. In that context, Japan has its own responsibility. At the same time, Japan needs to define how it deals with the Quad itself, because Quad is still quite loosely defined. And another factor is TPP, which I'm sure will become a quite powerful tool. And there is another framework such as RCEP. So there are different play cards potentially for Japan to use. And as Rory Medcalf said rightly, no one can solve everything on one's own by itself or himself. So what, and by one single means. So which cards to be used is the question. And Japan, as a coordinator or as a secretariat, will need to play a certain function. I think it is very essential. To add some words about the Quad, for instance, UK, and if some European nations say that they would like to join Quad, then Quad, for each different national interest, will have to become a recipient of all those countries willing to join it. If European nations would like to join Quad or some other framework for the sake of the well-being of the humanity, then I think Quad needs to become a good acceptant or recipient to accept them. And an ideal is not always the case in the reality of the world, even if it sounds tough. For instance, China already showed its willingness to join TPP. However, from the position of Japan, regarding China alone joining TPP, Japan cannot agree with that because if it happens, if a TPP accepts only China, then TPP would become merely means for China to realize its own hegemony. It might be the case. So in that type of juncture, US, which was one of the founder of the concept of TPP, Japan, I'm sure, will approach strongly US to join TPP as well. So Rory Medcalf also mentioned rightly China Plus. I think this is a very important idea. This is not necessarily a scope, I would say, but at the same time, if hypothetically in future China accelerates further with its ongoing hegemony, if that happens, then Quad and TPP will have to break it, will have to contain the speed of it, while not being squarely preventing China to accelerate it in front of that frontally, but then it will need to serve as a brake in a certain way, so that China will be integrated through a pathway for its integration into international community. I think in that sense, if we cooperate good enough, in a good enough way, Quad will be able to have the potential to become such a mechanism. This is my view.
Thank you, Admiral Koda. The integration of China into the international pathway, how to make that possible, how to find a solution about China which involves China. I mean, that is really the crux of the matter which we are all discussing here. If the organizers can collect questions, what I would like to do in between is, I see my friend Carlos here. Carlos, can you hear me? Carlos, at this intersection of, technology, trade, where we are, post 4 years of Trump, the discussion you've been listening to on the Quad, on the role of China on Quad 2.0, what is the view from your end of the world?
Well, we are very distant physically from there, but fortunately, I'm sorry to say, very fortunately, I see something that I don't understand in your discussion, which is, well, with the progress of vaccination in the US, especially in the US, economic activity in the US will rebound. And this will pull up all the supply chains around the world. You are not going to cut your rebound by curbing supply from China. Therefore, I see a speech regarding supply chains, and I see a reality, an economic reality that's going to come about. If I'm right, the American economy recovers fast in the second semester of this year. So there, I see a conundrum. Which is going to come first? Economic recovery or the geopolitical will to curb your challenger? We don't have two separate systems as in the time of the Soviet Union. We have an integrated fate. This is a very big difficulty. From my point of view, if you want to contain China more efficiently, it's not through supply chains in what China is integrated. It's through the supply chains of things that China doesn't produce. A country when it gets richer and richer, people will want to consume many more things, especially food. You have to improve your intake of protein. And even if the Chinese don't come to Brazilian standards in protein or American standards, they will improve. And since obviously the countries that export food are not so many, then you may reach a balance of interest. So my arguments are this: I am from the other side of the world, so I really look with a certain degree of amazement the discussion in that region. I think that the most important actors are the US, Japan, China. India will become a very important actor. Europeans are there because of tradition, but they really don't have a clout. Not in the long term, and this is a long-term play. And I wonder if Russia will have a say on that. But I really think that the economics side will play a bigger role in the second semester of this year than other disputes. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Would anyone like to respond to what Carlos said? Yes, Danny.
Thanks. I very much agree with the general point that economics are going to play a tremendously important role in the kind of geopolitical scene over the course of this year and next year. And it's just a question as to whether the timelines for global economic recovery match or undercut the quest for some geopolitical advantage between China and the West. I think ironically, when you look at the United States and China, both countries for very different reasons want to use 2021 to buy time. For the Chinese, it's to reduce some of their vulnerabilities. A case in point being their inability to acquire advanced semiconductors, chips, and fabrication. They need indigenous development there, but also to exploit many of the openings left over from the past few years, where China's been able to expand its influence in multilateral and other contexts. For the United States, an effort to buy some time just to reconstitute itself economically and politically and socially from the disaster of the last 4 years. So it may not be a competition as at such a high speed as many suspect, and that's not a bad thing because it creates some space to explore areas for reconciliation and cooperation. Last point I make is when we enumerate power centers in Asia, it would be sheer folly to overlook or to discount ASEAN because as decentralized and seemingly feckless as ASEAN can be, it's tremendously powerful in potentia. Its superpower is the youth and the dynamism of its public. So don't count ASEAN out.
Thank you, Danny.
Ambassador Ong, do you share that view on the ASEAN?
Yeah, of course I have to share the view, not because I have to take a pro-ASEAN perspective in my previous job as Secretary General of ASEAN, but I think that when you look at the situation now in Southeast Asia, we are really in the middle, Sunjoy. we have China, who is just next door, and the other big powers, United States of America, we share the same ocean, yeah, but quite a far distance away, as Carlos mentioned. Then on the other side, we have you in India, and the vast potential of the European countries, which have various contribution to the development in Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia. So I believe that the issue has always been focused on ASEAN's inability to cobble a specific solution crisis. Right now, for example, we have military take over in Myanmar, and the situation there is going to more dire situation every day. Yeah, and our people in Southeast Asia are asking, what can ASEAN do? But they fail to remember that ASEAN can do exactly not those things that they want. If we do those things that they want, or the protester want, or the people in the social media want us to do, then ASEAN will break away, and there will be no more ASEAN. ASEAN is effective in its own mechanism, is informal, quiet diplomacy, the way we try to bring both sides together. Yeah, of course, there will be some member states of ASEAN which try to do more and look for, a quicker outcome. Yeah, but I think overall ASEAN has managed to engage all the significant parties in the region as well as beyond the region to, peace of some sort in Southeast Asia. Yeah, many of my diplomatic friends reminded me that overall, yeah, although the situation of ASEAN effectiveness has always been discussed and raised in a negative way, the fact is that Southeast Asia has generally got a peaceful 4 or 5 decades now. Yeah. So what we need to do now is to move on and see how ASEAN can contribute to all these big things struggling in the international current. Returning to the basic subject of our topic, how to restore the economic order and democracy, as well as the international cooperation. I just want to say that I believe trust building is very important. And all the confidence building measures that we have, which I also include Quad, by the way, because of all the activities Quad is doing, contribute to a certain understanding of how a group of countries or how each of us operate. And this contribute to a generally positive attitude to the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Positioning the Quad in a larger framework of several other plurilateral institutions, multilateral institutions, is perhaps the way forward. Professor Rakesh Sood, from India, another region with the dynamism of youth, and you start looking at the growing cooperations in technology, vaccination drives. Can India provide some of these answers? Ambassador Sood, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I think that you're right in the sense that we are well placed demographically, and we should therefore, we are also very conscious. The government has been taking a number of initiatives. The most recent one that was announced yesterday was this inviting the expressions of interest in terms of developing a large semiconductor industry. We have a policy paper out that came out 2 years ago on artificial intelligence. So I think there is a strong move towards looking at the new developments, whether it is in terms of space capabilities. We are looking at privatization in space capabilities and enlarging the role of the small innovative space companies in India. And I think all of these are areas which can actually benefit the Asia Pacific as a whole. So therefore, particularly on the emerging technologies working group, I think that is clearly an area where India will have a role to play, because it fits in with our own national priorities that we have identified.
Okay, we just have time for 1 minute closing thoughts. Let me start with Admiral Koda. Just 1 minute, any statement you would like to make to wind up the session.
Yes. Is it me? Right? Indo-Pacific Strategy, or Quad. So depending on each country's approach, it can have a very big potential. But in other words, if we fail at approaching it, then we will be end up in failure. And that's why we have to gather all of our strength and wisdom. Thank you.
John, you from Chatham House.
Yes, just on the issue of Europe's role, I think, notwithstanding Carlos's skepticism, I think it's important highlighting how, particularly in the absence of Thomas at the moment, France thinking on an Indo-Pacific, Germany's decision to develop its own Indo-Pacific strategy, the Netherlands, there has been a shift in the way in which we conceive of the region. And as far as the UK is concerned, then the integrated review makes it very clear that there is an appetite to engage, and also, very importantly, to train a generation of China specialists. It will depend on the British government putting the resources behind that and developing it over time, but I think it's a positive step forward. The one, I suppose, additional caveat is with the merging of DFID, our development ministry, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, there is a question again of capacity. Do we have the resources that are sufficient to allow us to realise what ambition that the integrated review represents, and can we engage public opinion?
Rory, you can raise your book again and say the last word. You just have time for your thoughts.
Oh, just some propaganda there. That's very nice. No, look, seriously, thank you very much for involving me in this conversation. I think the last point I would make is about the expectations we all place on the United States now. I've said some very positive things about, I think, the strong start that the Biden administration has made with the Quad and with its engagement of allies and partners. We also know how difficult things were in Anchorage a few days ago. I think that's a reality check. I think it was a necessary position to take, but the hard work really begins now for the United States. And I think what the administration has to decide before very long is precisely what kind of role America is going to play, and in particular, whether some kind of shared strategy with allies and a diverse range of partners is really the objective. I think it should be. I think we need to help our friends in the United States move away from a vision of primacy as being the solution here. I think there's a new kind of leadership that needs to be developed that we need to work with America with. And I think that will be a more realistic foundation for the kind of balancing and stability that we're all looking for. So thank you.
So to conclude this session, from what I've heard from all our experts is that, yes, there is a lot of positive momentum in the new Quad as we are seeing it. And the way things are moving, maybe there is hope again for a new internationalism, a new kind of globalization, a new kind of multilateralism to take shape and build from here. Things which we are going to be discussing in the next few sessions. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a pleasure talking to all of you, moderating this session with you. I enjoyed every minute of it. Over to you, Kudo-san.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Thank you, all the panelists and also the moderator. Thank you very much, Mr. Sunjoy, Josh. And with this, we conclude the first session. Thank you all.